Frontal recess. The frontal recess is the drainage pathway of the frontal sinuses. Each frontal recess is surrounded by the following structures, namely the agger nasi cells, the ethmoidal bulla, middle turbinate, basal lamella, and the anterior ethmoidal cells. This is the frontal sinus drainage pathway. That is the agger nasi cell, the anterior ethmoidal cell, the frontal sinus, and the frontal sinus drainage pathway between the agger nasi and the anterior ethmoidal cell. Each frontal sinus narrows down to an inferior margin designated the frontal ostium. The frontal ostium extends between the anterior and posterior walls of the frontal sinus, and it is demarcated by a variably shaped ridge of bone on the anterior wall of the sinus, and it is oriented nearly perpendicular to the posterior wall of the sinus. Let us have a look at the frontal ostium. This is the frontal sinus, and that is the frontal ostium, extending between the anterior and posterior walls of the frontal sinus, a variably shaped ridge of bone on the anterior wall of the sinus. The frontal sinus drainage pathway has a superior and inferior compartments. The superior compartment of the frontal sinus drainage pathway is formed by the union of adjacent air spaces at the anteroinferior portion of the frontal bone and the anterosuperior portion of the ethmoidal bone. Let us study the superior compartment. This is the superior compartment of the frontal sinus drainage pathway. That is the frontal ostium. And this is the inferior compartment. The superior compartment communicates with the inferior compartment through a narrow area. The inferior compartment of the frontal sinus drainage pathway is a narrow passage formed either by the ethmoidal infundibulum or the middle meatus. This is the inferior compartment of the frontal sinus drainage pathway. When the anterior portion of the uncinate process extends superiorly to attach to the skull base, the inferior compartment of the frontal sinus drainage pathway is the ethmoidal infundibulum, which then communicates with the middle meatus via the hiatus semilunaris. This is the uncinate process attaching to the skull base. In this case, the inferior compartment is the ethmoidal infundibulum. That is the inferior compartment, and it is the ethmoidal infundibulum which then communicates with the middle meatus via the hiatus semilunaris. The hiatus semilunaris is a tiny gap between the bulla ethmoidalis and the uncinate. Because it looks like a half moon, it is therefore termed hiatus semilunaris. When the anterior portion of the uncinate attaches to the lamina papyracea instead of the skull base, the inferior compartment of this frontal sinus drainage pathway becomes then the middle meatus itself. Let us study this. This is the uncinate attaching directly to the laminae papyracea. Here is the middle turbinate, and this is the middle meatus. This becomes the inferior compartment of the frontal sinus drainage pathway when the uncinate attaches to the laminae papyracea directly. Together, the frontal sinus and the superior compartment of the frontal sinus drainage pathway resemble an Erlenmeyer flask, with the neck of the flask representing the frontal ostium. This is the superior compartment together with the frontal sinus, and this looks like an Erlenmeyer flask with the neck of the flask representing the frontal ostium. The inferior compartment of the frontal sinus drainage pathway could then be conceptualized as directly communicating with a small opening in the base of the flask. So here we have the frontal sinus, the superior compartment, the inferior compartment, and the communications.